Volume I Aggression in Manchuria Chapter 1. International Environment 1. The Revolution in China and the Great Powers. The significance of the Chinese Revolution after the First World War and until 1923. After the October Revolution in Russia, a revolutionary wave swept the whole world and shocked the capitalist system. This wave swept through Germany, Austria, Hungary, Japan. Rice riots of 1918 captured colonial independent countries: Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Outer Mongolia, Korea. March 1919 movement and, finally, China, where the May 4th movement began. During the First World War and immediately after it, capitalism began to develop rapidly in China. The national bourgeoisie began to emerge, and with it the proletariat. The labor movement expanded significantly. Under these conditions, the May 4th movement broke out, the first mass movement that was clearly anti-imperialist, anti-feudal in nature. After this movement, the democratic revolution in China entered a new phase. This happened because the Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia began an era of world revolution against international capitalism, and the Chinese Revolution, a typical national liberation movement in a semi-colonial country, was a powerful link in the chain of world revolution. The years 1923 to 1928 were a period of so-called relative stabilization for capitalism. Japan, England and the United States sought to reach a mutual agreement on the spheres of influencing China, as well as on the issue of its robbery. This stabilization of capitalism was supported with great difficulty, at the cost of the shameless robbery of China and other colonial and semi-colonial countries, which could not but cause an aggravation of the national liberation struggle of the colonial peoples. At the same time, the contradictions of imperialism deepened. The very foundation of stabilization was undermined. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was created. The next year, a strike of Hong Kong port workers broke out, and in 1923 a strike of workers at the Beijing-Hankou Railway. The role of the proletariat, the most dangerous revolutionary force for imperialism, has increased in the national liberation movement. The bourgeois Democrat Sun Yat-sen, previously relying on a risky rattling of weapons and not imagining the strength of the masses in the revolution, he learned a serious lesson from this movement. Already in the midst of the May 4th movement, he gave the following assessment of the role of the masses in this movement: what brilliant success they have achieved in such a short period. Strength is in unity. We will unite in the struggle for our demands, and then the militaristic Beijing government will not be able to reject them. Anti-imperialist movement. In January 1924, thanks to the active mediation of the Comintern, a united front of the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China was created. For the development of the Chinese Revolution, this was a historic event. Following this, the Canton Kuomintang government, having set itself the goal of resolutely ending militarism and imperialism, began to pursue a policy of assisting the workers, a policy of strengthening friendship with the Soviet Union. The revolutionary movement of the masses developed. With the help of the Soviet Union, the Wampu Military School was established in June 1924. The Revolutionary Army was strengthened. In such an environment, England immediately intervened in the affairs of China, using the armed organization of the comprador bourgeoisie and merchants in Canton, the so-called paper tigers. However, In October 1924, the Canton government defeated them. In the same period in northern China, the Chilean militarist Cao Cum, having bribed members of parliament, was elected president. But, since these militarists were absolutists, relying on the feudal system that existed in the village, the people launched a movement against Cao Cum. Sun Yat-sen began to plan a second campaign against the northern militarists. Zhang Zuolin and other militarists who opposed the Chilean militarists began a war with them. Cao Cum was defeated. In Beijing, the Duan Qizhai government obedient to Zhang Zuolin and Feng Yuxiang was formed. The people more and more resolutely demanded to convene the National Assembly, adopt a constitution, and create a democratic republic. Sun Yat-sen also considered it necessary to convene the National Assembly, to resolve issues of the people's life and to eliminate unequal treaties. To this end, in November 1924, he went to Beijing. However, the militarist Duan Qizhui cherished a plan to convene a deliberative conference, which should be attended only by representatives of the ruling classes. It was planned at the conference to discuss the issue of stabilizing the situation in the country, and, acting in close contact with the imperialists, to declare that unequal treaties would continue to be respected. In contrast to this, on March 1, 1925, the conference to facilitate the convening of the National Assembly opened in Beijing. But at this time, Sun Yat-sen became seriously ill and died on March 12, 1925. In his will, he said, "In order to make a revolution, raise the people, wage a joint struggle in the community with the Soviet Union, which should be attended only by representatives of the ruling classes." It was planned at the conference to discuss the issue of stabilizing the situation in the country, and, acting in close contact with the imperialists, to declare that unequal treaties would continue to be respected. In contrast to this, on March 1, 1925, the conference to facilitate the convening of the National Assembly opened in Beijing. But at this time, Sun Yat-sen became seriously ill and died on March 12, 1925. In his will, he said, "In order to make a revolution, raise the people, wage a joint struggle in the community with the Soviet Union, which should be attended only by representatives of the ruling classes." It was planned at the conference to discuss the issue of stabilizing the situation in the country, and, acting in close contact with the imperialists, to declare that unequal treaties would continue to be respected. In contrast to this, on March 1, 1925, the conference to facilitate the convening of the National Assembly opened in Beijing. But at this time, Sun Yat-sen became seriously ill and died on March 12, 1925. In his will, he said, "In order to make a revolution, raise the people, wage a joint struggle in the community with the Soviet Union." In contrast to this, on March 1, 1925, the conference to facilitate the convening of the National Assembly opened in Beijing. But at this time, Sun Yat-sen became seriously ill and died on March 12, 1925. In his will, he said, "In order to make a revolution, raise the people, wage a joint struggle in the community with the Soviet Union." In contrast to this, on March 1, 1925, the conference to facilitate the convening of the National Assembly opened in Beijing. But at this time, Sun Yat-sen became seriously ill and died on March 12, 1925. In his will, he said, "In order to make a revolution, raise the people, wage a joint struggle in the community with the Soviet Union. After the defeat of the Chilean militarists, the organization of the people began to grow rapidly. In May 1925, the All China Federation of Trade Unions was created, uniting the unions of the whole country. The federation immediately decided to join the Profintern. Within a few months, the number of members of peasant unions increased from 30,000 to 200,000 people. In May 1925, the first Congress of Peasant Unions in Guangdong Province took place. All this happened at a time when the imperialist powers, torn by the revolutionary crisis that had come after the war, sought to eliminate their internal contradictions by intensifying oppression in colonial and semi-colonial countries. England has long regarded the Yangtze River Valley as its sphere of influence and had textile and other enterprises in the area. In addition, she sought to turn China into a source from which she could draw funds to pay huge war loans during the First World War. That is why England took the most active action against the Chinese Revolution, against the development of the national economy of China. That is why the tip of the anti-imperialist movement in China was directed mainly against England. The United States, which turned into a creditor country during the First World War, has achieved tremendous development of its industry, and therefore every year expanded trade with China and increased investment in its economy. But since the USA did not have any special spheres of influence in China, they hoped to penetrate the Chinese market, defending a policy of open doors and equal opportunities. Japan, which sought to resolve its post-war political and economic difficulties, also intended to infiltrate China. However, faced in China with an ever-increasing anti-Japanese struggle, which began on May 4, 1919, as well as with the movement against England in America, caused by the decisions of the Washington Conference of 1921 to 1922, she came to the conclusion that it was more profitable for her to penetrate China in collaboration with England and the United States, and therefore chose the foreign policy course, dubbed Saidahara diplomacy, 1924 to 1926. On the other hand, Japan, taking advantage of the fact that the prestige of England and the United States in China was undermined, and the boycott of British goods after the strike of Hong Kong sailors in 1922 took on an ever wider scale, increased the import of its goods into China. But, despite the presence of contradictions between these imperialist powers, they equally hated the Chinese Revolution and therefore opposed it on a united front. In such an environment, in 1925, the famous events of May 30th took place. May 30th events in Shanghai, Hong Kong and other cities of China. There were a large number of textile factories owned by the Japanese and the British. The administration of these factories treated the Chinese workers very poorly, so the workers, along with the demand for higher wages, usually put forward other demands: to recognize the unions, not to arrest and not to beat the workers. The strike, which broke out in February 1925 in Shanghai at one of the textile factories owned by the Japanese, spread to other factories, which had the same difficult working conditions. 70,000 workers joined the strikers. In April, a strike began at the Japanese-owned textile mills in Qingdao. On April 8, in connection with the movement of Fuzhou students who filed a petition against the colonial education system, shootings of students took place. Under these conditions, The shooting of Chinese workers on May 15 by Japanese capitalist owners of textile factories could not but cause a storm of popular indignation. Students distributing leaflets calling for a relief movement for victims were arrested. On May 30, students entered the territory of the international settlement and delivered speeches there containing calls protesting against executions of workers. Stop arresting students. British police thrown to suppress the movement arrested students who spoke in protest. A crowd of 10,000 gathered at Ningkanlu, near the police department, demanding the release of students. There was a clash with the police. To suppress the movement, the head of the police department, the Englishman, gave the order to fire at the crowd, as a result of which a large number of workers and students were killed and wounded. This is the essence of the events of May 30. The events of May 30 caused an anti-imperialist popular movement throughout the country. On June 1, a major strike took place in Shanghai, in which workers, students, representatives of trade circles, and even Chinese policemen from the English settlement participated. In June, a joint committee of representatives of workers, trade circles and students was created in Shanghai, which took control of the anti-imperialist movement. A fierce struggle unfolded also in Beijing, Qingdao, Tianjin and other cities. On June 18, the Hong Kong Sailors Union went on strike, deciding to join the movement unfolding in Shanghai and Hongkou and wage a decisive struggle against imperialism. On June 23, troops of the imperialist powers fired at a 70,000-strong demonstration of the working people of Canton and Hong Kong. More than 200 people were killed and injured. The same imperialist powers declared the severance of diplomatic relations with the Canton government. In response, hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers of Hong Kong went to Canton and demanded to launch a movement to boycott British and Japanese goods. This strike lasted for 16 months until October of next year. Thus, the events of May 30 served as the starting point for the creation of a revolutionary alliance of all classes of China, led by the working class, with the goal of developing a national anti-imperialist movement. In the period from 1925 to 1927 there was a further strengthening of the foundations of the revolution. A special role in strengthening the revolutionary base belonged to the Canton government. The events of May 30 were of historical importance on an international scale. The problem that caused this incident also faced the working class of Japan, which was struggling with imperialism in their own country. It was this problem that was raised primarily by the All Japan Council of Trade Unions organized at that time. A movement began, calling on public opinion to help the Chinese workers to protest the government of Japan. Despite severe repression, the working class of Japan sent two representatives to Shanghai, Matamura Shiro and Yamamoto Kenzo. This strengthened the unity of the working class of China and Japan. Workers' representatives reached a unanimous agreement to strengthen the unity of the unions of countries along the Pacific coast. The Japanese workers have drawn rich experience from the practice of the revolutionary movement in China and were able to use it in their struggle. Faced with the anti-imperialist movement that broke out after the events of May 30, the imperialist states not only resorted to brutal executions of the participants in the movement, but also launched active activities to split the forces of the revolution. In relation to the Shanghai national bourgeoisie, which was afraid of the growth of working-class forces. They, on the one hand, took a rather soft stance, proposing to convene a conference to discuss the issue of customs tariffs and a conference on the regulation of its legal rights, and on the other, they began to threaten Chinese industrialists, who will stop supplying electricity and water to their factories and plants located on the territory of a foreign settlement. The comprador bourgeoisie acted in the interests of these states, a prominent representative of which was the president of the main Chamber of Commerce, Yu Keqing. As a result of this, on June 26, the main Chamber of Commerce disrupted the workers' strike trade enterprises and began to obstruct the development of the revolutionary movement. The masses were full of indignation. A wave of strikes swept even enterprises owned by the Chinese. After this, the big national bourgeoisie began to gradually take the side of counter-revolution. In October of the same year, the Conference on Customs Tariffs finally convened, which, after the Washington Conference, was repeatedly postponed due to the intrigues of France. At the conference, the imperialist powers in principle recognized the right of China to independently establish customs duties, but this decision was to enter into force only in 1929. In addition, at the same time, the condition was put forward that the Chinese government should eliminate lichen, one of the types of customs duties. The imperialist powers delayed the work of the conference. At this time, feuds between the various militarist groups that enjoyed the support of foreign imperialists began again. In the end, the foreign powers refused to participate in the conference under the pretext that in China there is no government capable of negotiating. Success of the Northern Campaign. When political unity was achieved in Canton, the revolutionary masses faced the task of overthrowing the militarists who were agents of the imperialist powers and liberating all of China. In May 1926, at the Third All-China Congress of Trade Unions, a decision was made to support the Northern Campaign of the anti-imperialist, anti-militaristic Cantonese People's Government, which at that time was actively preparing for the campaign. But just during this period, Chiang Kai-shek, around which the right wing of the Kuomintang was grouped, together with the national bourgeoisie, betrayed the revolution, aiming to remove from power the left Kuomintang government. On March 20, under the pretext that the Communist Party is preparing a rebellion, he expelled the Communists from the Whampoa Military School, as well as from the First National Revolutionary Army. In May, Chiang Kai-shek fabricated a project to streamline party affairs which limited the activities of the Communists. But at that time he still did not have sufficient forces to openly oppose the Communist Party. In July 1926, the National Revolutionary Army launched the Northern Campaign, the purpose of which was to destroy the counter-revolution. Chiang Kai-shek stood at the head of this army, concentrating in his hands both military and political power. He turned into a military dictator. On July 12, the Communist Party published the Fifth Declaration of the President, in which she called for the consolidation of a united revolutionary front of all classes and the overthrow of militarism and imperialism. During this period, in the north, thanks to the support of Japan, Zhang Zuolin expanded his sphere of influence. In the Yangtze River region, England helped the militarist Wei Fu to regain her feet, thereby strengthening the forces of the counter-revolution. The National Revolutionary Army first of all launched an offensive in Hunan, where the Workers' and Peasants' Self-Defense Army, organized by Mao Zedong and his associates, worked together with it. Then she swiftly turned north and defeated Hua Peifu's main forces in Hebei. On September 7, she took possession of Hongkou, and on October 10 occupied Wukang. In Jiangxi Province, the National Revolutionary Army entered into battle with the forces of Sun Quanfang and in November occupied Nanchang, Zhejiang and other cities. During this period, in the north, thanks to the support of Japan, Zhang Zuolin expanded his sphere of influence. In the Yangtze River region, England helped the militarist Hua Peifu to regain her feet, thereby strengthening the forces of the counter-revolution. The National Revolutionary Army first of all launched an offensive in Hunan, where the Workers' and Peasants' Self-Defense Army, organized by Mao Zedong and his associates, worked together with it. Then she swiftly turned north and defeated Hua Peifu's main forces in Hebei. On September 7, she took possession of Hongkou, and on October 10 occupied Wukang. In Jiangxi Province, the National Revolutionary Army entered into battle with the forces of Sun Quanfang and in November occupied Nanchang, Zhejiang and other cities. During this period, in the north, thanks to the support of Japan, Zhang Zuolin expanded his sphere of influence. In the Yangtze River region, England helped the militarist Hua Peifu to regain her feet, thereby strengthening the forces of the counter-revolution. The National Revolutionary Army first of all launched an offensive in Hunan, where the Workers' and Peasants' Self-Defense Army, organized by Mao Zedong and his associates, worked together with it. Then she swiftly turned north and defeated Hua Peifu's main forces in Hebei. On September 7, she took possession of Hongkou, and on October 10 occupied Wukang. In Jiangxi Province, the National Revolutionary Army entered into battle with the forces of Sun Quanfang and in November occupied Nanchang, Zhejiang and other cities, thereby strengthening the forces of counter-revolution. The National Revolutionary Army first of all launched an offensive in Hunan, where the Workers' and Peasants' Self-Defense Army, organized by Mao Zedong and his associates, worked together with it. Then she swiftly turned north and defeated Hua Peifu's main forces in Hebei. On September 7, she took possession of Hongkou, and on October 10 occupied Wukang. In Jiangxi Province, the National Revolutionary Army entered into battle with the forces of Sun Quanfang and in November occupied Nanchang, Zhejiang and other cities, thereby strengthening the forces of counter-revolution. The National Revolutionary Army first of all launched an offensive in Hunan, where the Workers' and Peasants' Self-Defense Army, organized by Mao Zedong and his associates, worked together with it. Then she swiftly turned north and defeated Hua Peifu's main forces in Hebei. On September 7, she took possession of Hongkou, and on October 10 occupied Wukang. In Jiangxi Province, the National Revolutionary Army entered into battle with the forces of Sun Quanfang and in November occupied Nanchang, Zhejiang and other cities, and on October 10, took Wukang. In Jiangxi Province, the National Revolutionary Army entered into battle with the forces of Sun Quanfang and in November occupied Nanchang, Zhejiang and other cities, and on October 10, took Wukang. In Jiangxi Province, the National Revolutionary Army entered into battle with the forces of Sun Quanfang and in November occupied Nanchang, Zhejiang and other cities. Thus, by the end of the year, the National Revolutionary Army liberated the entire area along the Yangtze River. She also found support in Shanghai, where on October 24 an armed uprising was organized under the leadership of the Communist Party. However, this rebellion was defeated, as the army of Sun Chuanfang was thrown against the rebels and, in addition, the rebellion itself was not sufficiently prepared. On September 17, Fu Nuixiang, who had just returned from the Soviet Union, was appointed commander of the northern group of the National Revolutionary Army. Feng Yuxiang urged the soldiers of his army to join the Kuomintang. By the end of the year, he restored order throughout the Shanxi province. In January 1927, the capital of the revolutionary government was transferred to Wuhan. April 12 coup, a decisive victory in the Northern Expeditionary War, led to the rapid development of the People's Revolutionary Movement. The labor movement across the country quickly revived. In Wuhan alone, there were 300,000 workers in the ranks of the trade unions. The organization of the peasants increased, especially in Hunan and Guangdong, and peasant unions were created everywhere. The peasants robbed the land of the landlords, divided it among themselves, armed themselves, and began a movement to ban gambling and smoking opium. This movement especially frightened the imperialist powers and their minions in China, who realized that with the help of force alone they could not suppress the revolution. On January 3, 1927, a meeting dedicated to the anniversary of the revolution was opened in Wuhan in a festive atmosphere, but English sailors fired at its participants, killing and injuring several people. Outraged people attacked the English police, guarding the territory of the English concession. Fulfilling the will of the people, the Wuhan government liquidated the English concession. On January 6, British troops shelled workers in Zhejiang. At the request of the masses, the English concession was liquidated in this city as well. As a result of the growth of the popular movement, England was forced to confine herself to a formal protest and retreat. This was an event that had no precedent in the history of the aggression of the imperialist powers in China. Faced with this situation, the great powers began to make every effort to cause a split within the Kuomintang, which was not difficult, since Chiang Kai-shek had long been preparing for a counter-revolutionary coup. He sent Dai Jitao to Japan, and through Huangfu, Zhang Kun, Wang Zhengting and others came into contact with the Zhejiang financial clique. At the same time, Chiang Kai-shek was in talks with the president of the Shanghai Main Chamber of Commerce, Yu Qiaching, who was associated with the imperialist powers. The latter promised Chiang Kai-shek to provide 60 million yen if he broke with the communists and began to persecute them. In the same period, the masses of Shanghai, in solidarity with the revolutionary Chinese army, which launched its northern campaign under the leadership of the Communist Party, began an uprising for the third time. After the first uprising, October 24, 1926, was defeated, on February 17, 1927, the people again rose to the armed struggle, timed their speech to the occupation of the city of Hangzhou by the National Revolutionary Army. This time, 360,000 residents of Shanghai organized a grand strike, but it also ended in defeat, as it turned out to be insufficiently prepared. In addition, the National Revolutionary Army suspended its offensive on Shanghai. Despite these two defeats, the working people of Shanghai began to prepare a third uprising. Political work was carried out among the broad masses, and shock workers' detachments were created and armed. On March 21, a general strike was announced, which included the vast majority of workers. Under the leadership of the Communist Party, the strike turned into an armed uprising. After fierce street fighting, the army of militarists retreated, hiding in a foreign settlement. The third rebellion of the people was a success. The next day, March 22, Shanghai workers occupied all parts of the city, and a few hours later the troops of the National Revolutionary Army under the command of Bai Chengxi entered Shanghai. By this time, political power was already in the hands of the workers, but the situation continued to be tense. It was still not clear whether the united front of the National Revolutionary Army and the workers would triumph, or whether the revolution would be defeated by a coalition of the national bourgeoisie and the armed forces of the international settlement. Assessing the situation, Chiang Kai-shek came to the conclusion that the time had ripened for the implementation of the counter-revolutionary coup. On the one hand, he entered into a political deal with imperialists and representatives of the comprador bourgeoisie such as Yu Qiacheng, and on the other, pretending to be a friend of the revolution, he began repressions against the forces of the revolution, using the compromising, opportunist policies of Chen Duxiu, who at that time leadership position in the Communist Party. First of all, Chiang Kai-shek banned the activities of the Shanghai City Committee. On March 24, when the National Revolutionary Army occupied Nanjing, the imperialist states headed by England and the USA, in the form of sanctions for the damage allegedly caused to their residents, fired on the city. More than 2,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians were killed and wounded. This broke the fighting spirit of the anti-imperialist movement and contributed to the withdrawal of the national bourgeoisie from the revolution. Approximately half a month after the Nanking events, a counter-revolutionary coup took place on April 12. On April 11, Bai Chengxi quietly pulled troops to Shanghai, formed gangs of hooligans and secret agents disguised as workers who attacked shock workers, and then disarmed these troops under the guise of liquidation of unrest. But the working people still believed their friend yesterday. On March 12, workers from all over Shanghai gathered at a city rally, and then headed to headquarters to hand over the petition. They reached Baoshanlu, where they were unexpectedly met machine gun fire. On the pavement remained mountains of corpses. The Shanghai Council of Trade Unions was captured by bandits and all its branches were defeated. Leaders of the labor movement were arrested, revolutionary organizations dissolved. A counter-revolutionary coup was carried out simultaneously in Nanjing, Wuxi, Ningbo, Hangzhou. On April 15, bloody reprisals were instituted against the workers of Canton. Closely connected with compradors and paper tigers, the top of the national bourgeoisie, represented by Chiang Kai-shek, who betrayed the revolution, was subordinate to the imperialists and lost its national character. The Chiang Kai-shek group, which turned into a new militarist gang, created, in contrast to the Wuhan Nanking government. Wuhan government moves to the side of reaction after the formation of the counter-revolutionary Nanking government. The Wuhan government expelled Chiang Kai-shek from the Kuomintang on April 17, 1927 and announced that he would be punished throughout the country. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek got in touch with the Zhejiang clique that dominated the entire Shanghai market. It was a group consisting of financial magnates and representatives of the comprador bourgeoisie immigrants from Zhejiang province. Having received help from her, he strengthened his strength and, having conquered the area in the lower reaches of the Yangtze, strengthened the economic blockade of Wuhan. Active support was also given to him by the imperialist powers, which concentrated their armed forces in the Wuhan area. The Union Jack and Shin-Yatze warships, as well as a large number of gunboats flying the Japanese flag, cruised along the Yangtze River, threatening Wuhan. Under these conditions, Wuhan's economy experienced enormous difficulties caused by a shortage of essential goods and an incredible rise in prices. Capitalists and merchants began to hesitate. Some of them contributed to the even greater collapse of the economy by installing liaised with the Nanking government, deliberately shut down their enterprises, sabotaged production, or ceased trade. But the Wuhan government was supported by workers and peasants. The unions led by Liu Shaoqi, preparing for the fight against counter-revolutionary conspiracies, strengthened the armed strike detachments. In the village, mainly in the Hunan province, a peasant movement led by Mao Zedong rapidly developed. In this province over 300,000 peasants were united in peasant unions. Self-defense units were created everywhere. The peasants arrested large landowners and village rulers, the main support of the militarists in the village, robbed them of their land and divided it among the peasants. The development of the revolution thrilled the highest officers of the local armies, who were in the service of the Wuhan government. These officers, sons of landowners and representatives of the village elite, joined the national revolution in order to connect himself with a powerful new political force, to overthrow the old northern militarists and strengthen their own positions in the political and economic fields. They did not at all want tenants to become the main force in the village. In addition, the peasantry who had risen to fight did not indulge their families. So, the peasants arrested the parents of the commander of the 36th Army, put caps on their heads with the inscription Takao Leshan, which means a large landowner and a local dresser, and led them through the streets of the village. Faced with this powerful upsurge of the workers and peasants' forces, the leaders of the Kuomintang's left wing in Wuhan, Wang Jingwei, Sun Ke and others criticized under the pressure of the capitalists and the military, saying that the workers and peasants movement is doing irreparable harm to the national revolution, and demanded correction of these excesses. In early May, riots broke out in local armies. In Changsha, the main city of Hunan province, the local army contacted the Kuomintang right-wing leadership and arranged a coup in the interests of saving the party. Workers' organizations and peasant unions were crushed and dissolved, and over 100 communists were shot. The rebels demanded that the Wuhan government break with the Communist Party. In this situation, the commander of the Northwest Army Feng Yuxiang took a neutral position and acted as an intermediary between Nanjing and Wuhan. He advised Wang Jingwei and Sun Ke to send Borodin, an advisor to the Soviet Union, to break with the Communist Party and unite with the Nanking government. In early June, Wang Jingwei and Sun Ke removed Borodin from work and intensified repression against the workers and peasants movement. The fate of the Wuhan government was being decided. Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi, who from the very beginning insisted so that instead of inappropriate local armies, strong volunteer formations, consisting of workers, peasants and students, are created, further strengthen the work to strengthen the ranks of the workers and peasants movement that can overcome the crisis. They considered it necessary to arm the participants in this movement and foil the counter-revolutionary conspiracy. To eliminate the coup in Changsha, a 10,000-strong peasant self-defense detachment, which surrounded the city, was thrown. The success of the operation was ensured by the fact that workers in the city quickly armed themselves. To eliminate the coup in Changsha, a 10,000-strong peasant self-defense detachment, which surrounded the city, was thrown. The success of the operation was ensured by the fact that workers in the city quickly armed themselves. To eliminate the coup in Changsha, a 10,000-strong peasant self-defense detachment, which surrounded the city, was thrown. The success of the operation was ensured by the fact that workers in the city quickly armed themselves. However, Chen Duxiu, who was the secretary of the Communist Party at that time, rejected the proposal of Mao Zedong and his supporters, ordered the siege to be removed from Changsha and the armed workers' detachments dissolved. By making agreements and concessions, he sought to maintain a united front with the Kuomintang. Using these fluctuations of the Communist Party at such a critical moment, the militarists intensified the terror. During June-July, with the blessing of the left wing of the Kuomintang, merciless repression fell on the left forces throughout the area under the authority of the Wuhan government. Thousands of workers, peasants, and students were mowed like rice was mowed in autumn. The gap of the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. In the end, the Central Committee of the Communist Party decided to secede from the Wuhan government. Sun Yat-sen's widow, Sun Qingling, made a statement before leaving, saying, "The Kuomintang leaders of the Wuhan government are traitors to the revolutionary cause of Sun Yat-sen, whose cherished dream was to give shoes and rice to Chinese children, also left the government." It was followed by Go Mojo, Deng Yanda and other persons who spoke in favor of friendship with the Soviet Union. The period of unity of the Kuomintang and the Communist Party is over. Across China, not to mention Nanjing, a wave of white terror swept through. Cities and villages were flooded with the blood of tens of thousands of communists and sympathizers. Lu Xun depicts the horrors of the time as follows: "They do not spare the life of people, which is given only once. Do not spare the youth. I am not a radical reformist, and therefore I do not oppose the death penalty. I only express deep regret and bitterness over the killings with the use of torture, the destruction of entire families. I believe that it is not worthy of the people of the 20th century. Perhaps a quarter of a person or stabbing with a bayonet does not mean killing him with torture, but is it really impossible to smash his head with one shot? Indeed, in both cases the enemy will be dead. But facts are facts. The bloody drama has already begun. On August 1st, the Nanjing workers, together with the revolutionary troops of more than 20,000 men and led by Zhu and his supporters, rebelled in response to the fierce white terror. The rebels organized the People's Revolutionary Committee, in which Song Xinglin, Go Mojo, and others took part. However, the uprising was defeated, as large military forces were thrown against it. In December, about 60,000 workers of Canton launched an armed uprising, held under the slogans, "Down with imperialism," "Down with the militarists," "Bread workers," "Land to the peasants," "All power to the Soviets of workers," peasants and soldiers deputies. As a result of this uprising, the power of the Soviets was first established and a bloody reckoning was carried out with the forces of the counter-revolution large landowners. But even this uprising was defeated, for all the forces of the counter-revolution in the city were thrown against it, as well as the troops of all militarist groups. In addition, the rebels were subjected to artillery shelling from foreign ships. During this period, the Wu and Kuomintang government and other Kuomintang groups, which achieved unity in the face of the Red threat, eventually united with the Nanking government, and a Chinese national government was formed, headed by Chiang Kai-shek. The forces of the Chinese Revolution were gradually retreating, overwhelmed by a wave of white terror, the horrors of which are already evidenced by the fact that at least 10,000 workers and peasants were killed from January to August 1928. The sending of the Japanese troops by the Tanaka cabinet to Shandong took place right at the height of these events. 2. The global economic crisis and the changing international situation. The end of stabilization. The development of the Chinese Revolution, which shook the foundations of the relative stabilization of world capitalism, forced the ruling classes of Japan to switch to a policy of active aggression against China. This sharpened the competition and contradictions between Japan, on the one hand, and the imperialist forces of England and the USA, on the other, giving rise to the cause of a new war. The conclusion of the Locarno Agreement in 1925 and the Kellogg-Briand Anti-War Pact in 1928 at first glance created the impression that the international situation had stabilized and that any threat of war was excluded. But the further development of the Chinese Revolution was reflected in the fact that the stabilization of international relations was achieved at the expense of the colonial peoples. It showed that from this side, stabilization is beginning to undergo serious blows. When in 1929 all countries of the world, with the exception of the Soviet Union, were seized by the global economic crisis, stabilization came to an end. The deepest depression, rising unemployment, declining living standards of the people, increased political reaction, an arms race, and the aggravation of the international situation have become commonplace. International agreements were torn, and each country chose its own path. The threat of a world war was growing. The situation in the Far East, as well as the international position of Japan at that time, developed in close connection with world events. The Anti-War Pact, beginning with the phrase, "On behalf of each people, the refusal of war is solemnly declared an instrument of national policy," was concluded between a number of powers in Paris in August 1928. In less than a year, more than 60 states joined it. It seemed that finally, 10 years after the end of the First World War, the principle of international cooperation regained its strength and eternal peace ceased to be an unrealizable ideal. In all countries of the world, the currency stabilized, credit was restored, foreign trade revived, industrial production increased. The development of America, which held a leading position in the capitalist world, was truly astounding. It sang boundless, eternal prosperity. So, at the end of 1928, the President of the United States Coolidge, never before has the Congress, at the meetings of which we now have to give a general assessment of the situation in the United States, faced such promising prospects. Our country, which is satisfied 63 with what it already has, can look into the future with deep optimistic and the director of the famous General Motors Corporation said, "My point of view regarding 1929 is based on a firm belief that our economy and industry are in every way healthy." From 1923 to 1928, during the period of the so-called relative stabilization of capitalism, the capitalist states, thanks to the economic leadership of America, rationalization of the economy and suppression of the revolutionary movement within the country, were able to achieve a certain economic stability. They managed to overcome the economic devastation that arose as a result of the First World War and to liquidate the post-war revolutionary crisis. However, this political and economic stabilization collapsed at the very first blows of the global economic crisis that erupted in October 1929. This indicates how relative stabilization was. At the same time, it is in this period that one should look for explanations of the causes of the crisis that led to the Second World War. There is no doubt that the capitalist world of the period of stabilization carried all the prerequisites in order, being at the zenith of prosperity, to fly into the abyss of the economic crisis. The fact is that the economic recovery in European countries depended to a large extent on the import of American capital. In addition, Japan and other economically backward countries developed extremely rapidly. Therefore, the restoration of industry in European countries contributed to increased competition between these states and the United States, Japan and other countries. The growth of industrial production in the metropolis, due to the rationalization of production, led to the impoverishment of the working masses and, consequently, to a narrowing of the domestic market, which inevitably led to overstocking of industrial products. In these 64, under the conditions of capitalism of the metropolis, if he wanted to develop, he had to intensify the robbery not only of the workers of his country, but also of the masses of the colonies. This inevitably caused resistance from the peoples of China, India, Indonesia, Morocco and other colonial and dependent countries and led to the emergence of a national revolutionary movement there. Since about 1928, the ghost of overproduction began to hover over the global economy. The agricultural crisis hit Canada, Australia, Argentina and other countries. So the capitalist world gradually crawled into the crisis. In the end, this crisis erupted, and the first country that was covered by it was the United States. Economic crisis October 24, 1929 on Wall Street in New York began a catastrophic fall in stocks, which immediately spread to the stock exchanges in London, Amsterdam, Brussels and other cities. The crisis erupted both in industry and in agriculture. In accordance with the structure of the world economy and the laws of its development, the crisis, spreading over Canada, Japan, China, and then the colonial countries, quickly spread around the world. The speed and breadth of its distribution varied depending on the country and sector of the economy, but in the end the whole world was swept by an unprecedented crisis in its depth. World industrial production and trade have halved. One after another, enterprises went bankrupt, wages decreased, layoffs continued, and the number of unemployed increased. By the end of 1932, in Europe alone, 20 million people were unemployed, and around the world there were about 35 million unemployed. The prices of goods fell. The drop in prices for agricultural products was especially significant. In order to stop this drop in prices, in Brazil, 10 million bags of coffee were burned, thrown into the sea or used instead of slag for the construction of highways during the year. In London, a huge number of oranges were thrown into the sea, the cargo of a whole ship. Due to lack of marketing, agricultural products were overstocked or destroyed. Therefore, the peasants who produced these products eked out a miserable existence. The peasantry in the colonies were especially in dire need. The South China Morning Post wrote, in the suburbs of Shanghai Wampu and on the banks of the Yellow River, Shanxi Province, markets for selling people have been created. There, for $2 or $3, girls under the age of 10 are sold. The price for girls over 10 is $5. A severe agricultural crisis erupted in the United States. The Chicago Tribune newspaper wrote at the time that Arkansas farmers had used up the last remnants of their meager supplies. Cattle were brought into the woods, where they are doomed to starvation. Farmers' children do not have clothes to go to school. Their last hope is the help of the Red Cross.